Hey team, you're about to experience my interview with Jennie Alexander. Jennie is a longtime B2B e-commerce specialist, and she has worked with large-scale corporates and CPG brands developing and scaling their B2B e-commerce capability. She is a B2B e-commerce user experience specialist, and we talk all about how to create great user experiences for B2B customers. Enjoy. Welcome to B2B Commerce Corner. Commerce Corner is a sub-series of the E-commerce Edge podcast discussing all things B2B commerce through the lens of agencies, consultants, merchants, and more. Enjoy. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Jennie Alexander to the podcast. Welcome, Jennie.
Thank you for having me, Jason.
It's so cool to have you along for the ride today. We first met in person at B2B Online Florida in October of 2023, so not that long ago. We had a fantastic fireside chat from the stage, and ever since then, I wanted to get you on the podcast to talk B2B e-commerce. You come from a big corporate B2B commerce background with large CPG companies, J&J, et cetera. And now you've gone freelance. Now you've started your own consultancy. Now you're doing similar things to what I do. You're helping brands out there establish B2B channels, improve B2B e-commerce channels, helping D2C brands establish B2B channels. You've moved out of this big corporate monolithic space where, making fast moves isn't normally associated with large corporates. And now you've moved into the hyper agile space of being an e-commerce consultant. But what a transition. So how did you originally get into e-commerce in the corporate space to begin with?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here and great to be sharing the stage, if you will, with you again. So I got into B2B, honestly, it was pretty natural. My educational background was all about removing friction. So it was a degree in human factors engineering. So it was half psychology, half engineering. And when you put those two things together, you think about the usability of things and how you just can make things easier for someone to use, less risk, less ability for someone to get hurt using machinery, for example. So I literally studied how to make it easier for people to do tasks, right? If you think about the traditional space that I learned in, it was airplane cockpits, right? All those buttons in an emergency, you want to make it easy for a pilot to know exactly what to do and what not to do, what levers to push, what buttons to push, and what not to do. And so things like that were what I studied and what I loved to do and what I learned when I was younger, back in college. And fast forward to getting out of school, and I was just right place, right time, right industry. It was late 90s, early 2000s, and really started to learn the internet or e-commerce software side of things a little bit before they were really calling it truly B2B e-commerce, maybe, at least in a broad sense. And so I learned how to build use cases and run workshops and facilitate getting user requirements and turning that into what are great online experiences. Most of the companies that we worked for at the time were B2B or somewhat utility based. And so naturally, I have just loved that space and have stuck with it now for over 20 years. I've had a couple of detours into the direct to consumer area, but have come back to be over and over again because it's just such a natural part of who I am, trying to solve those business problems. And what a better place, no better place to be, really.
And you worked for Estee Lauder for over a decade, and you were running e-commerce for them, global e-commerce, some of their skincare ranges, et cetera. And most of these large CPG brands that you've worked for, they have a global footprint. They're household names. Obviously, Johnson & Johnson, Estee Lauder, everybody's probably heard of those. They probably have some of their products in their kitchen, in their bathroom, in their car. They've probably got these products maybe in their purse, et cetera. What I learned, and my mother used to work for Estee Lauder via Meyer in Australia, where she was technically employed by Estee Lauder, helping to sell their products. And she was working in cosmetics. And my mother was older when she went into that space, and she was helping women feel better about themselves and helping them fit cosmetics that were working for them. But this was very much a partnership between these manufacturers of these products and the retail channel. So obviously, most of these brands now have some form of a D2C channel, but historically they didn't. They didn't sell direct to consumer. They didn't have pop-ups in malls. They just didn't have a direct to consumer channel. They were very reliant on their B2B relationships with retail chains to be able to get their products into the consumer's hands. And I'm sure that it must have been quite the evolution. You've been doing this for a really long time, and I'm guessing in the corporate space, depending on the size of the buyer, the B2B buyer that you're working with, sometimes it's EDI, sometimes it's punch out, sometimes it's self-service e-commerce, well, more laterally, self-service e-commerce on the buyer side. And what did that evolution look like internally at these big, giant, behemoth companies when they say, hey, look, we want to decide which digital commerce channels we're going to make available to our buyers? What does that look like? If I was a fly on the wall and I was sitting in those meetings with those internal conversations of trying to figure out what resources we were going to allocate to digital channels and why, and how we make a business case around that, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a great question because there's certainly some really key decisions that were made probably in both companies, both larger companies that I've worked for. So both Johnson and Estee Lauder companies, some very early on decisions that were made that helped enable where they are today within each of sort of their commerce domains. And so I'll focus a little bit on J&J just because it's a bit more relevant from a B2B perspective. But quite early on for Johnson & Johnson Vision Care specifically, which is one of the franchises that I worked for, which is AccuView contact lenses, for those of you that don't know. Vision Care equals, for the most part, AccuView contact lenses. It was a really simple decision in the sense that there was a very large sort of customer service presence that would be available for retailers or for small optometrists, ophthalmologist offices to call in, and whether it be place an order, ask a question about a certain particular lens or anything, right? You have a fairly large customer service call center. And for the team that was helping to manage that call center, they quickly realized that there's a lot of elements and there's a lot of questions that these customers can really self-serve on. And so it was truly born out of that, out of trying to do two things. One, externally for the customer, make it easier for them to just quickly get their questions answered. You don't have to pick up the phone and call someone. It's just right there on your screen in front of you. You can see when your order is going to get delivered or place an order, whatever it might be. Just have it be self-service and easier for someone who might be, multitasking, not be able to pick up the phone and call, or not want to, certainly, but just make it a little bit easier. And then what it did is that freed up the call center to really focus on value add or more challenging conversations or answers to questions that someone from your office or someone from the doctor's office might have or might need answers to. Something that required more of a conversation versus just, where's my order? Let me go into the back-end system, look it up, and tell you where your order is. It came out of a little bit of a need of both of those. And what's actually really interesting, when I joined, and one of the first things I learned and saw regarding the B2B site for Vision Care was a really interesting attribute that was born out of exactly that. The first thing that a customer service team member might ask a customer when they're calling in and saying, I'd like to place an order is, first, is this order for your office? I.e., are you buying a bunch of stuff that are stock order? Or is this order specifically for an individual patient? And that sort of led to two very distinct paths down your sort of e-commerce roadmap, if you will, to then allow for one path and one cart that was for your stock orders, things that were going to, contact lenses that were going to be in your office, in your doctor's office, or a single item that you want to check out with and maybe use a different payment method even and ship that to someone different than where all of the paperwork and your accounts receivable, accounts payable, and everyone within the back office knows where your office is, but you want to ship it to Joe Smith in Ohio instead. That's just another path that you could take. And you can switch back and forth between those two carts in a way. And so it really lends itself to a very almost conversational way of doing e-commerce, because it's really how the customer service reps used to then place their orders for a customer. And so it was born out of a very natural kind of space.
And really what you're describing is the difference between a business ordering for their physical retail location and almost like having stock on hand for specific situations, generic situations that, hey, we can prescribe this, whatever it might be, versus a dropship model. That's really what we're talking about here is a dropship model where we're saying, hey, I'm going to call in on my business account. I'm going to have it charged to my business account, but I'm going to have you ship it direct to my end customer in a dropship fashion. And so I think that that is a perfect description of how B2B e-commerce is oftentimes multimodal, right? We sometimes have a situation where we're going to be selling through multiple channels in a B2B way. We might be selling B2B in a physical location. We might be selling B2B online. We might be selling B2B in a will call scenario where literally they're ordering, the B2B customer is ordering online and then they come. What's the equivalent of click and collect in the B2C world is will call. In the B2B world, we don't call it click and collect. We call it will call, which is usually maybe somebody would place an order and then your warehouse is down the road and they come and they pick it up because they need it right now and they can't wait for it to be delivered, or they're waiting to do a job for a customer. And so they need those products straight away. And I think, and then we get into a scenario where in some cases, we need what's called CPQ, configure price quote, where we need a very specialist product for a very specific application. And I'm guessing even in your case with Vision Care, the customer may need something that is not a stock line item. They may need something that's custom made for them. And so when they place the order, you need to capture a whole lot more information about that application before you can almost make to order and either ship that out or make it available for will call, right?
Yeah, you would think. And in some cases, certainly yes. But it really comes down to some amazing manufacturing qualities that you have when you think about contact lenses. And you can boil down maybe 12 different types of contact lenses, then into about 40,000 SKUs, probably even more. And so it really comes down to stock and inventory management, both at the customer level, right? So for someone who really has a very high level prescription with contact lenses, but it's quite unique and it's not being ordered necessarily all of the time, what stock level do you need to have for that? Or do you need to have that actually manufactured because a big order has just come in? And that is absolutely some of the back end processes that I've seen in my sort of, I guess, time at some of these bigger corporations to say, how do you make sure that you have, if you use Estee Lauder as an example, all of the right parts, pieces, and components to put this holiday set together, but you're doing that sometimes in April for next holiday and trying to get everything right. But then at the same time, you don't know what you don't know in terms of what the trend or the forecast for that particular item might be. So I've seen a really interesting application of this, not with any of the companies that I necessarily worked for, but a competitive company has essentially a mobile manufacturing warehouse that is just inside essentially a freight container. And they've set it up to work with their e-commerce solution to be a little bit on demand for that e-commerce customer. And it can essentially switch between a couple of different product lines and make product as needed based on what the volume is that's coming in from an e-commerce ordering platform. And it's right there, right next to your warehouse, but it's mobile. So it could move if you needed to move it to another distribution center because your orders have started moving from East Coast to West Coast or what have you. And that's where the volume is. You pick it up and move it to another distribution center. And then you can make the product and just have everything be like one step closer, if you will, to the customer and to that order and all of the parts and pieces that go in between it.
Wow, what an interesting concept to have effectively a mobile manufacturing facility in a box. Now, if we think about moving from the big corporate space into the space that we play in, which is consulting. And for example, I don't consult to very large corporates. I consult to they're all privately owned companies. They are oftentimes family businesses. They've been around for 2-3 generations. They own their space. They are either the primary wholesaler or distributor of their product, or they're the only manufacturer of their product because it's a bespoke product for the market. Not to say they don't have any competition, but oftentimes there's something unique about their product that makes their product desirable over their competitor's product. And oftentimes when I'm going in to consult, they're implementing e-commerce, self-service e-commerce for the very first time. Even if they've got EDI for their largest customers, they've never done self-service e-commerce before. And that becomes a totally different ball game with a totally different required skill set to be able to execute on that opportunity. With EDI, it's mostly an IT exercise, making sure that your ERP can receive orders from the buyer's ERP. It's mostly hands-off from a human perspective. There's not a lot of human effort that goes on behind that. It's not I'm a sales rep and I'm taking an order over the telephone from a customer and then I'm manually entering it into my ERP. And these brands oftentimes, if they're doing EDI, the way in which they're usually interfacing with their customers outside of the EDI model is a field sales rep or an internal sales rep model, where they've got their book of customers. They're calling them up once a week, once a month, whatever their call cycle is. They're saying, hey, Joe, hey, Jill, what do you need this week? What do you need this month? Or that customer is maybe emailing them a spreadsheet. Okay, here's my order for this month. I'm emailing it to my account rep. They're manually entering that or uploading that into the ERP for fulfillment. And all of a sudden, now with the advent of e-commerce, that buyer is saying, especially for replenishment ordering, I don't need to talk to my sales rep. I don't need to talk to my account representative. So why am I being forced to go through that channel just to place an order? I would actually prefer that I could just log into a website just like I do in my personal life to order stuff online that I want. Why can't I just have a web interface where I can log in, I can do all that stuff? If I want to request a quote, I should be able to do that. I should be able to see my price list. I should be able to do everything online in a self-service way. At least 90% of what I can do with my sales rep, I should be able to do online, especially for that replenishment ordering, which is just part of my job. I got to do it every day. It's part of my procurement process or my job and my function within the business. Why do I have to go through, it feels like, hurdles to be able to spend money with this supplier? And that's where we've got to, which is there's two things happening at the same time. The seller wants to be more efficient, and they want, because sales reps are very expensive resources, they're very specialized resources, and they maybe want to make them more productive because a lot of their time is spent. I've seen this, up to 60% of an internal and external sales rep's time can be spent on admin tasks that don't actually add any value to the end customer. And they would like to free them up to build more relationships, go and acquire new customers, go and chat to new customers, and take away the admin burden. And then the customer also wants to do the same thing. They don't want to do manual admin themselves. They would rather do it in an automated way. So we've got the perfect storm where both buyer and seller want to automate certain processes to make the buying process easier. And I think that's where it feels like the true demand is starting to come from for self-service B2B e-commerce. Are you seeing the same thing?
I am. And I think that there's some interesting nuances to that. And it also depends, like you said, based a little bit on the size of the organization, right? The size of the seller. And so I'll use a bit of my expertise. And when you think about really large manufacturing, really large CPG companies, there's a couple hurdles that these companies have that may be unique to them, but certainly are ones that are getting in the way of them accelerating B2B e-commerce. And the first is the compensation model for the sales rep, right? That's the number one thing that you hear inside large companies as well. If we have our sales rep if our sales rep doesn't place that order and that's how they're compensated, that reorder, for example, how the hell are we going to compensate our sales rep? And that seems like, when you say it, there's clearly some obvious ways that you can do that, right? There might be a for all of those reorders, the sales rep gets some sort of compensation. There's other compensation models that you can use to move them out of that model into something that's more, like you said, value add. That seems to be a really sticking point, especially for large corporations where this is the way that we've done it for years. And that becomes a challenge. So that's step one, is moving a little bit beyond that and trying to see what sort of the new sales rep and that new model could look like. When you have B2B as an enabler to the sales rep and to the customer, you're going to be in a 1 + 1 = 3 relationship very quickly, but you need to be able to get over that hurdle. You need to sell that hurdle into those internal teams. And that is historically can be a challenge for companies that have been doing it one way for a very long time. I think the other side of the coin, there's a unique challenge that big manufacturers, big CPG companies have when it relates to then a small customer. Sure, you can set up EDI. You should have EDI set up with, say, your Walmarts, your Targets, and your big box retailers, and even your medium-sized retailers, of course. But what happens when you have a mom and pop shop, your grocery store down the street, and you want to sell your products inside there, but they don't take EDI and they're not big enough to have a sales rep call upon them, or they're not in an area, a metropolitan area where your sales reps are calling. Of course, you need e-commerce in that space and with that use case so that you're not only just losing physical shelf space, you don't have any. And if you don't have any physical shelf space in that environment or location because you don't have an e-commerce solution, and you're not going to have Joe's snack box down the street EDIing orders to a major manufacturer. That just doesn't make sense. They're not set up for that. What happens? That business gets fulfilled likely through a distributor, and then you're just eroding your margin along the lines because you have a distributor in place. And that was the solution back in the day, certainly. And it's a fine solution. There's nothing wrong with distributors, but I think e-commerce is the new distributor, so to speak, because that can be a very self-serve type of use case where then those individual stores, sort of mom and pop stores, if you will, that are all across the world, all across America, small town USA, can have your products and can order them and can self-serve in a way that makes sense. And then you as the CPG get that data, right? You're not sending a giant order to a distributor warehouse. You might be consolidating something and shipping it that way, perfectly fine, but at least you get the individual order and what's happening in that small town USA, and you know what your trends look like from a consumer standpoint. You're one step closer to the consumer that way. And for me, I think that's something that has been a hurdle, of course, for some of these large corporations. And for a smaller company that's just starting out and saying, hey, we're gonna have a B2B e-commerce site, they can just much more quickly, much more nimbly be able to get that up and running. And then guess who's on the shelf in store? It's going to be that person who's more nimble and has more ability to quickly get that product to that customer, and they're going to be the ones who win. So I think you're seeing a lot of that struggle, if you will, from a large corporation perspective, but a lot of that from a smaller company's perspective, they're able to get it up and running much more quickly, and that certainly helps them in the long run.
Yeah, I think we're seeing this trickle down even into when I go to a Walmart, or when I go to a Costco, or when I go to a Sam's Club. I used to see and it still happens occasionally, but certainly not as much as it used to see 2-3 people from, say, the same family who maybe had a shop down the street, and they go in there and they buy a whole bunch of stuff off the shelf, but it's for resale, right? They go and they buy all their Coke cans, they go and they buy all these different products from off the shelves, and they buy them hundreds at a time or cases at a time, and they take it down to their local shop, and they sell it that way because they didn't have, prior to self-service e-commerce being provided by these larger brands. They don't necessarily have to be the huge public companies, but even the medium-sized B2B brands. Without B2B e-commerce, there was no easy way for their small chain retailers. Maybe they got one shop, maybe they got 5 shops, but they're still considered a small retail chain. They had no way of being able to interface with these medium-sized and larger B2B brands and they wouldn't even be able to create an account with those brands because maybe their sales weren't as predictable. Maybe they didn't warrant having an account manager that they could deal with. And those B2B brands, maybe in the old world, maybe they were accepting orders via fax, maybe they were accepting orders via email, et cetera. And then they decided, wow, the cost to us to service that small of a retailer through those manual channels is just so expensive. It's not worth it. So you need to be doing a minimum amount of volume before you can buy directly through us. Otherwise, sorry, we can't help you. Now it feels like self-service e-commerce has bridged that gap almost regardless of the size of B2B buyer. And that's why I think we've seen MOQs come down dramatically with the advent of self-service e-commerce. Now, usually B2B brands will still have some form of an MOQ, but certainly nothing like it used to be to warrant being able to have an account with that seller. And so it feels self-service B2B e-commerce has democratized access for buyers to sellers. And that seems to be one of the biggest sea changes I'm witnessing in the market.
Absolutely. And I think that what it's uncovered is then what goes on behind the scenes, right? You talked about MOQs. Your MOQ is a case pack in some cases, right? That's just the easiest way to move from, okay, what should our MOQ be? It's a case pack of 12, so order 12. But that small retailer that has 1 or 2 or 5 stores maybe doesn't need 12, but needs 6 of something else. So how can you be agile and nimble as an organization and say, we can put 2 plus 2 together in that case and give you 12 of something, but it's 2 6s essentially, right? And then everyone's winning in that case, but the democracy of B2B e-commerce, like you said, has uncovered these back-end processes or these sort of pieces that are in place, that have been in place for a while, that do also need to change. So I completely agree with you that it is opening up a lot of doors, but it's uncovering where there are either silos in an organization that don't understand, then how to maybe move into a bit more of a nimble approach, or just your process that doesn't allow that to unfortunately happen. And that then becomes, well, e-commerce isn't the solution. It's not working. Let's move on. And that's frankly ludicrous. It's really about, well, what else needs to be true? How do you put that customer at the center of what it is that you're doing and service that customer in the best way possible? And yeah, it might mean taking a hard look at some of those other processes that are going on that are post-order all the way up until that gets on shelf at a customer's store, to be able to manage that. And there's a lot, I think, that of work that can continue to happen in that space, just to be able to make it easier on the customer and then a win for that corporation, that manufacturer.
And a lot of times those rules and those policies were set at a time when back office systems and also fulfillment and logistics were not able to be agile. They just couldn't be, because the cost to become agile in the back end was so high. But with modern OMSs, with modern WMSs, with modern 3PL services, with the capabilities today to be able to fulfill partial orders like that and partial inventory, and with chaotic put away in warehouses now, because now we've got systems that manage the physical locations on our shelves and manage that much more efficiently than they used to. And so therefore we can now put the remaining pack of 6 in a space on our shelf that can handle the space of 6, as opposed to only having shelf space that's pre-designed in that bin for an entire case. Now we don't have the same restrictions we had 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, when some of those processes and some of those policies were established. They were established at a time when they were appropriate for the day, but they're no longer appropriate now. And I think what you're referring to is the need for these businesses to say, why do we have these rules? Why do we have these policies? Maybe they made sense 10 years ago, but do they still make sense today in the context of our upgraded systems, our updated partners, our updated processes, our updated manufacturing. And maybe now we could actually create an outer that is 6 units in your case. Instead of the 6 units being an inner, maybe now we can create multi-style packs that have their own discrete SKU in our system. Okay, the 6-pack gets this SKU, the carton gets this SKU, and I don't know, maybe a pallet gets this SKU, for example. Now we've got different units of measure, and that's not a problem for us to manage in our ERP, for example, and our OMS and our WMS. And so I guess just in a nutshell, what you're saying is it's worthy for these businesses to spend the time looking at all the rules and regulations and boundaries that they put in place that probably made sense when they were made because you had no other choice. But do they still make sense today? And do they make sense for your buyer today? And if they don't, I'm always the advocate for the saying that sacred cows should be shot. And so I think what you're saying is these sacred cows inside these B2B businesses that maybe have been operating for 50, 60 years, maybe they need to take a look at all the sacred cows in the business and make a second look at this, a second pass at this, and maybe say to themselves, maybe it was a sacred cow 20 years ago, but it's probably not a sacred cow today. Let's get rid of it. Hey team, I have a big favor to ask you. Please pause this episode and send the link of this episode to someone you know that you think would enjoy this content. Really appreciate you spreading the word. This is how we grow. We're not a Joe Rogan. We don't have big, massive advertising budgets, but we absolutely want to grow. We want to get the learnings from all of these episodes out to as wide of an audience as possible, and we need your help to do it. Thank you. And now back to your listening.
Yeah. And absolutely, because business has changed, like you said, right? And if you're not serving the new customers that are coming in and want to do business this way, you're just going to lose market share. So it's a complex challenge because undoing those processes and changing that business model around is painful and hard, but it's required if you want to continue to focus and to win in today's market. You have to eat your own lunch. You have to change some of those policies and those procedures to be able to service the customers that are coming in that are smaller, more nimble, and require a different approach to just something as simple as a case pack. Someone, in some way, shape, or form, that 12 case pack got packed together. Put your ordering system a hell heck of a lot closer to when those 12 things in your manufacturing get popped together. And I don't want to say problem solved because it's obviously a little bit harder than that. There's systems, there's potential integrations, there's changes that need to happen. But if you had those systems a little bit talking a bit more to each other and your order system a little bit closer to your manufacturing, then you aren't going to be dropping 12 into the outer box. You might be dropping 333. You might be dropping just a different assortment in. And that takes a hard look at your entire process and not just saying, what is my front end of my e-commerce system doing or not doing, right? It's not just the front end system.
Yeah, and it's especially difficult if you've got thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of SKUs, and all of a sudden now you've got to change processes and rules and policies and more importantly, business rules, because usually those business rules live in ERP, or that's where the business rule originates. It originates in the ERP. And so you now have to take a very hard look at all of the cross-functional components that need to come together to furnish that front-end experience, because you might have a head of business systems, you might have a head of IT, you might have a head of procurement, you might have a head of logistics, you might have a head of sales that you've got to push this through and say, look, if you make this available in a 6-pack instead of a 12-pack, now my sales are likely to drop because now I'm not forcing them to buy 12, they can only buy 6. So there's oftentimes in even medium-sized organizations, there's a tremendous amount of politicking and fiefdoms that go on. And these teams oftentimes are not used to having to work together cross-functionally to get a great customer outcome. And what I find is that it forces, when you introduce e-commerce into a B2B business, it forces you just have literally no choice. You have to get IT at the table. You have to get business systems at the table. You have to get logistics at the table. You have to get sales you have to get everybody who is going to touch that process from beginning to end. If they have anything to do with that sales process whatsoever and fulfillment process, you better get them around the table, and you better get them talking, and you better get them having those heated arguments or the banter that is required to figure out the North Star, which is, hey guys, I know you've got your challenge. I know you got your challenge. I know you got your challenge. But the North Star here is we're trying to make this easier for our customer, not just easier for us. Because if we make it easier for our customer, ultimately, we will sell more. Ultimately, we will have a stronger brand in the marketplace. And ultimately, the customer, the end consumer of those products, however it gets into that customer's hands, they're going to have more access to our goods at the end of the day. And therefore, we're going to have greater brand reach, greater brand recognition, and we're going to ultimately do more revenue. Basically, I like to say, sort your shit out. Don't make this a blocker just automatically because it means your team or your department is going to maybe have to do a little bit more work for every single sale, or is going to have to do some more work up front from a business process or business rule perspective to make this possible. We just have to bite the bullet. The customer wants it. We want it because it's going to make us ultimately more efficient, and it's going to make us more scalable. It's going to allow us to take on completely new customer segments that we could never tap into before, and it's going to allow us to gather data we could never gather before, which is ultimately going to make us a better, more efficient business over the long term, and ultimately going to make us a more sustainable business in the long term. Our customers aren't going to have products sitting on the shelves because we sold them too much and they could never move the product.
Yeah, and then return it, right? Because it's aged out. And I think that you touched on something that's so interesting, because those e-commerce teams, the ones that are there in those companies that are fighting for true and real digital transformation, are the ones that, first of all, are probably having the hardest time, because they're trying to get all of these people to the table, because their job is impossible to do if you don't have everyone else there. And just truly trying to focus in on that consumer, customer, whichever, at the center, and bring all of those other teams together. And they get shit on all of the time, because they're like, why are you trying to do this? Why don't you just do your job? Like, why are you trying to pull us all in to make all of these changes somewhere else? And the true e-commerce, I think, leaders and visionaries within those organizations that are really trying to pull all of that together to make those digital transformations happen are the heroes in this case, right? They're the ones that should be getting all of the praise, and we should be pushing and propping them up as much as possible to be able to have these other parts of the organization, these siloed parts of the organization, see exactly what it takes to run a business with more agility, right? And how you do that, and why it takes that entire team and all of these processes to potentially change or adapt or shift to something it's a behemoth of a job at some of these larger companies, even at some of these medium and smaller sized companies. It's quite hard to do, and it's a thankless job at times for some of these people. And if you get those success stories that happen, those should be celebrated within our industry as much as possible, because I know that behind every one success story, there's probably 10 e-commerce managers out there being like, if this just happened, my job would be so much easier, and I can't get these two people to talk to one another. That needs to be happening, and that needs to be pushing the way that e-commerce is done. And it doesn't have to be massive changes, right? Those digital transformation changes can happen there can be parts and pieces of it that happen quickly so that you can see some of those wins. But that's, I think, where a lot of the frustration from your e-commerce leaders and your e-commerce managers comes, because there's so much dysfunction behind the scenes that doesn't enable them to grow 20, 30, 40% the same way they were able to do that 4 or 5 years ago. Even it's not there anymore, because you have to work harder, and because those systems need to be connected. If they're not, great, you'll settle for 5% growth year over year. The choice is yours, right? Which one you want to take, and how you want to attack it.
And I think you point out a very good thing here that a lot of B2B brands should take to heart, which is that if you're going to bring on an e-commerce manager or a head of digital or a CDO or whatever it is that is leading the charge on the self-service e-commerce front, you really have to enable and empower them to basically, I wouldn't say force the other departments to fall in line, but you have to give them some level of authority to push change, to encourage change, to enable change within the business, to where, whether that be setting up cross-functional KPIs, to where everybody in the business has to, it's part of their requirements of the performance of their job. They have to be able to help enable e-commerce in the business and not put up roadblocks. And maybe it becomes part of their compensation. Maybe it becomes part of their performance review. Maybe we have to think, we have to be agile enough as B2B brands to think, okay, maybe if these other teams aren't naturally inclined to assist and aid delivery of the e-commerce function in the business, because they go, that's the e-commerce manager's job. It's not my job. That's their job. They have to think about that, and they have to worry about that. Yeah. And they have to figure out how to make the e-commerce system work with our existing other systems and processes within the business. And to a degree, that is true. We can't operate in a vacuum, and we can't ignore all of the other changes that need to happen in the business to enable a really solid e-commerce function, but neither can the other departments and other department heads and leaders in the business ignore what we need to maybe adapt and tweak to be able to support and enable the e-commerce function either. Basically, no one can operate in isolation in the business. And so the business really needs to take a long, hard look at itself and say, what are the roadblocks to change? Because if you have a roadblock to change from an e-commerce function perspective, I guarantee you have roadblocks to change in every area of your business, which means you are not an agile business. You are a rigid business with rigid processes, rigid rules, and it means you are not going to be able to adapt in any way to market changes. You're just simply not going to be adaptable, and probably you are going to become less relevant to the consumer over time if you can't fix that rigidity problem that you have and that rigidity mindset that you have. If you can't fix that, you got bigger problems than just e-commerce.
Absolutely. And the days of that's not my job, that's so 2010, like that, it's just, you can't operate that way anymore, right? That's not how you're going to drive a business that needs to operate much more collectively, right? You can't have one part of your sales organization have a goal that is just in complete opposition with another department's goal. It drives innovation, sure, and it drives competition among teams. And that's great for organizations that are already agile, nimble, and innovative. But if you're not, and you're just driving competition, it just drives friction within your entire business process and you get less done. So you do need to take a hard look at that. And those teams do need to be empowered to say, listen, if you need me to grow 20%, we have a couple things on the table. I can discount the crap out of everything and run promotions all year long and watch me hit pretty close to 20%, but your P&L is going to look pretty darn awful. Choice A, or choice B, let's really get under the covers and fix some of what's like under the hood, what's wrong here with how we're operating so that we can drive a sort of systemic and profitable change within our business processes. And that is much harder, but a more sustainable way to go to be able to then have the right customer-centric approach to it, and putting those leaders into a room and having them argue it out is very important to some of these organizations.
Yeah, and I also think that this, in some respects, has to be a top-down effort. It's bottom-up in the sense that the customer is at the bottom. They should be at the top of our pyramid, but oftentimes they're at the bottom of our pyramid. But the change is being forced on us bottom-up from the customer, and they're saying, no, we need you to operate in these ways. If you want to sell to us, you need to be agile enough to be able to sell to us through these channels and in these methods. And you can't be all things to all people. Like I know, for example, a lot of these businesses, they used to, in order to sell to a certain B2B customer, they had to accept checks, for physical checks, for example. And I know a lot of those B2B sellers just decided ultimately, sorry, no, we can't accept check payments because of the amount of time in processing, the delays in payment, the delays in freeing up credit on your account, etc. It's just making the whole experience terrible. It's making it terrible for you too. You may not realize it, but it's actually making it terrible for you too. And there's certain things about these processes we can't fix. And so I'm not saying that every brand should do every single thing that the customer asks for, regardless of how marginally creative it is to the business. I'm saying you still have to be strategic about how you think about servicing your customer. But if the bulk of your customers, or if a significant chunk of your customers are saying, we need a really great self-service e-commerce experience, then you should probably be listening. Otherwise, you're probably going to hemorrhage those customers. And if it's within your power to deliver that, and it brings other efficiencies to the business anyway, then why wouldn't you want to do it? Why would you resist that? Why would you fight against
Absolutely.
that? And the reality is, even when it comes to sales teams, and maybe we'll finish on this because we're coming to the end of our time together, and I really do appreciate your time. When I go in and I start consulting to these brands that say, hey, we want to do e-commerce, or we want to do e-commerce so much better than we're doing it today because our customers are asking for it, and we see this as a huge opportunity to grow our business, one of the first things I ask them is I say, first of all, have you come up with any kind of an adoption plan? Or have you started down the path of an adoption plan, both an internal and an external e-commerce adoption plan? Have you started to think about what T's are you going to need to cross and what I's are you going to need to dot to start gathering information from your customer base before we go into scoping this new solution? Have you talked to customers? Have you asked them what type of functionality they would ideally like to see in your e-commerce experience? Have you asked them what their pain points are? Have you asked them, if they buy off some of our competitors, have you asked them what they love about some of the competing B2B e-commerce experiences that they are using today with other vendors? Have you asked them what they love and why they love it? Have you asked the sales team, hey, how could we look at potentially incentivize you to, because you're going to be the ones usually sitting alongside the customer and walking through those first 1, 2, 3 orders to help them onboard them into this e-commerce system and help get them comfortable with using it. Oftentimes it's the field sales team that'll be doing that task because they're the ones that have the relationship with the customer in their back pocket. And so I think that adoption planning needs to start typically much earlier than most brands do it today. Oftentimes they'll get halfway through building their e-commerce solution, and then they'll start thinking about, oh, we need to start communicating with customers that this new e-commerce experience is coming. We need to communicate with them, okay, it's going to launch on this date, get ready. Your sales rep is going to be reaching out to you to help you onboard you into the system. They leave it till almost the last minute, and then they wonder why they get a lackluster adoption percentage, both internally and externally, when those teams, both internal and external, have not been brought along on the journey, and they have had virtually zero input on what the ultimate result is in terms of experience. Yeah. That feels like a dog chasing its tail.
Yeah, and I've seen that happen more than my fair share of times when you see a team say, we need e-commerce. And my first question, we need this product launch to be e-commerce enabled, whatever that might be. And my first question is, okay, what is the business problem that you are trying to solve? And have you thought about that? Have you talked to your customers about that? Because e-commerce is not a business problem that you're trying to solve. It is a solution to a business problem. Now, it's a great solution to a lot of different business problems. But if you're not talking, to your point, to that adoption of what is it that the customer actually needs, you're not creating a solution that's built for them or that will be adopted, or like you said, which is a great example, that your sales team will even know how to sell, right? This isn't salespeople can sell product, the product that they sell day in and day out, and they do a great job at that. But when you ask them to sell something different, a service, a different type of product, a digital solution, something that they're not necessarily as comfortable with, you better start bringing them on the journey at the very beginning and understand what skills they might need, what additional training they might need, what tools they might need to be able to sell that. We got into a situation like that where we realized that there was a group of salespeople who, based on their geography, when they went into certain locations, had no internet. So the laptop or the iPad that you give them to sell that digital solution that's not connected to the internet isn't going to do a very good job of helping them sell. It's just because of their geographic location. And so you have to think about all of those parts and pieces to be able to do it. But it starts with just connecting with the customer and figuring that out so that you know that you're not just building a solution for the fun of it, but you're building one that's truly going to get adopted.
And I love the saying, you get what you incent, right? So you get what you incentivize. And so the reality is sometimes with sales teams, sometimes I've seen, hey, look, in order to encourage adoption and encourage buy-in into this project, maybe for every digital order that gets placed versus a physical order, you get an extra half a point of commission. For example, I've seen this work really well too, where we've said, hey, look, the people that are intimately involved in helping onboard customers into this solution, sometimes they need a little nudge too, because it's getting them outside their comfort zone and they're having to do something new and they're having to take responsibility for something that they've never had to be responsible for before. So let's say, okay, sure, if you're in a named account and the customer decides to buy through the online channel, we're not going to take the commission away from you because it's a named account. So who cares which channel they place their order through? You're still going to get your commission. But for the new digital channel that we're introducing, the more orders that come through that channel, you're going to get a little tweak to your bonus. You're going to get a little extra incentive to do that extra effort to bring that customer on the journey of getting them onboarded into this new digital system. You're going to get an extra half a point of commission, right? To your point right at the beginning, maybe we have to look at holistically in the ways in which we incentivize the entire team to onboard joint KPIs across the business. And how do we need to incentivize? Because maybe for teams other than sales, for example, maybe the incentive isn't money. Maybe there's a different kind of incentive we need to give them. And maybe we need to craft that incentive within the context of that role or responsibility within the business. And so I think businesses need to, the e-commerce experience, oftentimes they look at it as a sledgehammer solution. They say, this is the silver bullet for all of our problems across the organization. We're going to save a ton of money. We're going to become lots more efficient. We're going to retain better margins, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Oftentimes, e-commerce can introduce as many challenges into the business as it solves. And so you really have to think about that, and you have to start thinking, how are we going to make sure we get ROI out of this solution, both for us and for our customer? Because remember, the customer, anytime they've got to change a process, there has to be an ROI in it for them too. So if they have a traditional way that they interact with your organization, if they're used to emailing a CSV of their order to their sales rep, and that's the way they've been doing it for a decade, in order for them to learn a new way of doing things, that's a time investment on their part. And so all of a sudden, you're asking them to invest effort into you in adopting this new solution. So there has to be ROI in it for them. And you have to be able to very clearly articulate what those benefits are to them. Otherwise, you're going to get some resistance there, and they're just going to do what they've always done, which is to email their account rep, and they're just going to carry on as they've always done. Listen, Jennie, this has been an amazing conversation. You have some insights that are totally unique because of your background and the very large scale organizations that you've worked with over time. I just so appreciate your insights that, this angle that you come at things from is pretty unique. And I'm so thankful that you're willing to share from your deep pool of experiences with me and my audience. I super appreciate that. Now, as we come to the end of our time together, I always like to flip the script and hand the microphone over to my guest. Let them ask me one question, any question they like, can be personal or professional. So Jennie Alexander, what's your question for me today?
Goodness, great way to flip the script. I think question for you is, how did you get into the B2B space? That's something I don't actually know about you. Maybe everyone else does, but I don't. So let's go ahead. How did you get into the B2B space?
Very good question. Look, I guess I've always, especially the agencies that I've helped to build over the years, we've always had a component of B2B, but usually it's been a very small component of our agency business. It would usually be somewhere like 90-10 or 80-20, working with D2C and B2C brands versus B2B brands, because historically B2B has been very late to the party, been very immature. Not all B2B brands wanted to do e-commerce. And so there just was not as much demand out there. And then I think COVID changed all that. COVID put a fire underneath a huge number of B2B brands that could not get their salespeople into the field during COVID. And that caused them all to have a really harsh gut check. Oh my God, we don't have any digital routes to market. We need to really fix this, because this is probably not the last pandemic we're going to have. This is probably not the last major business disruption we're going to have. We really need to have multiple routes to market, and digital has to be a key part of this offering that we have. And it just really shone a spotlight on how immature a lot of these B2B businesses are and were. So I saw demand increase quite dramatically for B2B solutions during the pandemic. And then when I went out on my own, I knew that as a consultant, and selfishly, there was already every Tom, Dick, and Harry, it seemed, was a B2B, a B2C, or a D2C consultant. But yet I didn't see that many B2B specialists in the space. And I thought, why would I go into a red ocean space where there's tons of competition and it's very difficult to differentiate yourself versus going into a space that I know quite well and there's hardly any competition. There's very few B2B specialists out there in the market. And it was like, from a competitive advantage perspective, I felt like I could leverage that B2B experience I had to really win in the market as a consultant and bringing new ideas to the table. But to be honest, the additional selfish specialization thing with B2B came down to, I was frankly a little bit bored of the B2C and D2C space because I'd worked in it for so many years. And a lot of the solutions became vanillaized, I like to say, where there was this just really common stack that kind of everybody was recommending. Maybe it was Shopify, Klaviyo, Gorgeous. There's a personalization, maybe there's a preferred search merchandising solution, personalization solution out there, and everybody's got their favorite stack, but there became these really generic design patterns that started to develop in the B2C and D2C space. And there wasn't a lot of novelty that you could bring to the table as a consultant. You were recommending mostly the same things everybody else was offering at certain levels of scale of the business that you were consulting to. And it just got a little bit boring. It got a little bit dull. And so the B2B space is the opposite. Like the B2B space, you're dealing with a myriad of back-end systems. You're dealing with a myriad of processes. You're dealing with a myriad of business models, some pure play online, some omni. B2B brands now, more than ever before, now also want to have a marketplace play, both maybe their own marketplace plus listing on other third-party B2B marketplaces. Just there is zero vanilla in the B2B space. Like it is so much more complex. There's so much more variety to it that it's super interesting, and no two engagements are the same. Literally no two engagements are the same. And so for me, it just kept me really engaged with the process because of the unique challenges that B2B brings to the table. And I'd love to ask you, is that similar to maybe some of the motivations of why you decided, hey, I want to stay in this B2B space, but I want to do it as a consultant?
Yeah, I love what you said, because it's the idea of like how much you and I love the challenge, right? And getting in there and trying to solve it, because like you said, from a B2B perspective, the nuance that's there as to how you might solve it, the availability of solutions is much more limited. So you have to really put on this creative hat that than, from a B2C or a D2C space. And there are, of course, plenty of challenges within the D2C world, but there's a lot more of a formula that you can follow. And if this, then that, or if that, then this, and then next that you can follow. And it doesn't always work, of course. I'm not saying that it's easy, but that just doesn't exist quite the same way. Or maybe the formula is just much more complicated from a B2B perspective, where you're like, I have a client right now, and I know for a fact that the customers that they have are at work. They're likely on a desktop or a laptop or something like that. And so we want to solve and drive more customers through specific channels and through specific marketing activities. And yet I see all of this engagement happening on mobile, on their site, and orders. And you have to figure that out. There's no answer to that necessarily. You talk to the customers, right? That's the answer, is you talk to them. What are you doing? Why are you placing this order on your mobile phone when I know that you're sitting at your desk because it's a corporate environment that you're in, where you're placing these orders? What is it? And then how do you solve that sort of their business challenge, knowing what that is? And there's no exact guidebook for that. You have to dig into metrics, talk to customers, and figure it out. And that's what I love about it. Exactly similar to what you said. There's just a creativity, I think, that you need to bring to the table.
Absolutely love it. Jennie, it has been fantastic speaking with you today. I'll drop the link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes for everybody to be able to find you and get a hold of you. Other than LinkedIn, how do you like people to reach out and get a hold of you and have a chat to you? If they want some help with e-commerce, or if they just want to talk shop about e-commerce, what's the best channel to find Jennie Alexander on?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is primary for sure, but just feel free to reach out via email. I'll let you post that, my email address, but that's honestly going to be the easiest way to find me. I'm on LinkedIn and always checking my email. So definitely reach out either of those two ways, and I'd be happy to have a conversation.
And especially if you are in Florida, you're local to Jennie, and she could probably even come and see you on site. So yes, I've really enjoyed getting to know you. I appreciate your time today. I appreciated getting to know you at B2B Online Florida in October. I'm really looking forward to the next couple of B2B Onlines this year and hope to see you there. And I look forward to chatting with you again soon. Thank you so much for your time, Jennie. Are you a B2B or D2C e-commerce merchant? Then head over to greenwoodconsulting.net to learn how we can help you scale your business.